Good evening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 129 of Scotonomics. Just give me 1 second. Okay, I'm not going to the Independence Live Facebook page, which is a shame, but hopefully you'll be able to get me on the other social media platforms. What we're going to cover tonight is a summary initially, and then hopefully a question and answer on the paper that I co-written with Dirk Ehnts that looks at the role of fiscal rules in an independent Scotland, assuming that we follow the current Scottish Government plan to align with the Stability and Growth Pact before we're members of the European Union. And that's what we're going to cover in detail. Now, the paper was sent out to round about 200 people yesterday. It would be amazing if 250 people were able to read a 23-page report and join us tonight. So I'm not expecting that many of those who are watching live will have read the paper, but I hope if you have scanned it, then you'd be able to have some questions for me and I can answer them. The first thing I'm going to do is give a very short presentation, which I think gives you the highlights or what I want you to take away in general from the presentation. But I really want to, as much as I can, force you to read this paper. I think it's really, really important because it's starting to do something that's not been done before, and that is to directly challenge and question the considerable work that's been put in by the Scottish Government on coming up with a plan for independence without really listening to other alternative views. So this paper, we hope, is the first in a series, and I think the paper that the Scottish Currency Group are doing with Thee Blorenjoy will be something similar. But we really need to look at the plan as it's been laid out as much as we can and start to question it. Because if we really want a prosperous, independent Scotland, we have to make sure that all the due diligence is done. And that's really all that we've done in this paper. We've looked at a particular area in a lot of detail and come up with a conclusion that doesn't match what the conclusion comes up with from the Scottish Government. So I think it's absolutely essential that we do this work, and all your help and support allows us to do that. Well, in the background, scribbling away, is Karen Van Sweden. She's going to jump on at the end of this presentation. Hello, Karen. The viewers can't see you, but I can see you. Karen's making some notes during the presentation. She'll have a few questions, and then I'll bring any questions or comments that you have. I've also got a few comments from the various streams, the various social media platforms who've been covering and who've looked at the paper and the couple of articles. We had an article in the National yesterday and a National in Brave New Europe today. So we've got quite a few comments and questions coming up from that. So hopefully you've got a few questions for me once I go through this, but we do have some people who've asked some good questions on the other platforms. Okay, so please do drop in and say hello and let me know if you have read the paper. That would be good to know. I know there was a brilliant interview on Independence Live's TNT show tonight. So hopefully you've got a little bit of break if you did tune into that. Okay, so I'm going to bring up this presentation here. Let's go. So the title of our paper was Undermining Economic Resilience, the Economic Impact of Adopting the European Union's Stability and Growth Pact in an Independent Scotland. Now, these are the takeaways that I hope come out pretty obvious from the paper. The first one is that the Scottish Government's current economic plan for independence is not fit for purpose. The second one, and getting into the real detail of what we looked at, adopting the EU's fiscal rules is not appropriate for an independent Scotland. Third, adopting fiscal rules would lead to severe austerity and could ultimately derail economic independence. And then fourth, Scotland must tailor economic guide rails to focus on economic independence and a resilient economy. So a very different approach from what the Scottish Government is planning at the moment. So I suppose the best place to start, if I'm going to criticise the Scottish Government's plan for a post-independent economy, I need to kind of lay it out. So I think the most important thing to start is this underpinning idea. And this was from John Swinney just at the start of this year. Now, John Swinney said, "I believe that rejoining the EU should be our clearly stated goal and a national mission." So I think this underpins everything that's been happening probably since we lost the referendum in 2014, certainly through the Brexit period and certainly since the Brexit period. So that's 3 administrations, I think, are all as Eurocentric as each other. But this is what underpins the whole economic framework and journey is this idea that at some point we've got to rejoin the EU. And that's absolutely crucial. And I'll go into detail why. Again, the plan, this is what I've pieced together from publications, from comments from senior SNP officials. I'm pretty sure they'd be about 90% comfortable with this kind of plan. Now, you can pick it apart a little bit, but I want to just show you where I think we are. Let's say there's a yes vote in 2030. It'd probably take about 5 years. It's about the length of the Brexit negotiations to get to Independence Day. And on Independence Day, we're going to use sterling. So let's say we're using sterling, which is the English currency, for 2 years. That takes us to 2037. And then 2 years later, we start using the Scottish pound or the Scottish currency. We use that for 3 years, and then we're able to apply for the EU, because you've got to kind of show to the EU your economy is complying and that you're able to manage your economy in the way that the European Union would want you to. So you apply for membership in 2040. Let's say it's super fast and takes a couple of years. We're a member after 2 years. And then after 3 years of using their own currency, we move to the euro. Now, I'd like to hear what people think of that as a plan, but also if you think I've picked up the right things from the Scottish Government, because they've done quite a lot of work in individual areas, but they've never really put this clear framework in place. And certainly they've never been as brave as to put any kind of dates on it. But I think that's where we are. But the point I really want to draw your attention to is at the bottom of this slide, which is the convergence with the EU economy. Right from the day after, once the hangover is shifted, the Scottish economy has to start converging with the EU economy. Right at the start, if our end destination is a member of the EU. So all we've really done in this paper, and as I said, I really hope this starts people asking the same question, is what happens in the period after winning independence and before we become a member of the EU? What impact does convergence have on Scotland's economy? It's a fairly simple question to ask. We've got this end direction, we're independent. What impact does convergence have? And I don't think this has been answered to any degree in the current economic papers or by anyone in the Scottish Government. We hope we can change that. So within Building a New Scotland, there's a really important phrase, and it says, economic independence will allow the Scottish Government to tailor policy to Scotland's needs, build greater equality and well-being, and become more resilient. Now, I'm sure anyone or everyone who's watching will say absolutely, but the really important point for me is this idea of tailoring policy. And straight away, you can kind of think, well, if you want to tailor policy, let's say you did want fiscal rules, why would you adopt the fiscal rules from the Eurozone? Surely you would just create your own fiscal rules. That's if you needed or wanted fiscal rules. But it's interesting, the papers say tailoring, but the actions say converging and copying. So I'm going to go into that in a bit more detail. Thanks for your question, Alan. We'll hopefully get to that. I think it's really important for me to say is that this is a macroeconomic analysis. And what I don't want to get into too many specifics about certain parts of the economy, because they don't really have a substantial or a significant impact in how the tool that we've used for this report, which is the sectorial balances, which show the difference between the government spending, private sector spending, consumption, and the foreign sector. So I'll probably brush over some of these really if they're quite, kind of macro, although they're important areas when we go through the questions. So let's take a step back. 2030 to 2045, the Scottish economy has got to converge with the EU economy. So I've picked up 5 things that means. Now, there's probably about 20. I think these are certainly 5 of the most important, but they're certainly not all of them. So the top one, interest rates must be at the same or similar rates as the European Central Bank. So if Scotland's got an economy and it's wanted to converge to the EU, interest rates need to be about the same. Now, that's really hard if the Bank of England is setting those rates. So that instantly causes a problem. And you'll see that period from when we're using sterling to when we move to our own currency. The interest rates and the European Central Bank at the moment are 2%. The Bank of England's is 4%. So you'll see there's a huge difference at the moment between rates. But that's what we would have to start doing. We'd have to start converging to an interest rate that was similar to the European Central Bank. once we've got our own currency, we'd have to run a soft or a hard peg with the euro. Now, this means that we're going to need significant foreign exchange reserves to back or defend the Scottish currency, because we're not letting it float freely. We've got to maintain a price level against the euro. Now, you've got to keep inflation similar to what it is in Scotland as it is in the Eurozone. Now, this means, without a shadow of a doubt, higher unemployment than necessary, because we all know that that inflation is used as a way to counter the amount of employment in the economy. So it means higher unemployment. The fourth thing is that we must be open up to EU exports and investment from the Eurozone. Now, at the moment, 11.5 billion net income flows out of Scotland every year. It's around about 5% of our GDP goes back to foreigners who've already invested in Scotland. Now, this isn't talking about trade and exports and imports. This is simply about financial flows. So as soon as we open up to the EU and the Eurozone, that's likely to rise, and that has a significant impact on the government's chances of reaching a smaller fiscal deficit, which we'll get into. And then the fourth one is that we've got to in some way align with the Stability and Growth Pact. And this is what our report is all about. Now, what we have said is that this is going to ensure a decade and a half of fiscal, industrial, and monetary sovereignty. Now, I'm sure Scotonomics will be looking at, or I will certainly be looking at, some of these other areas over the next couple of years, but I hope other people are looking at these areas too. So what does aligning with the Stability and Growth Pact mean? And this is what's at the heart of our paper. Well, the Stability and Growth Pact is fairly simple, although very complicated in detail. But every government has to have a 3% deficit to GDP and 60% debt to GDP. So when Scotland becomes a new nation, it's likely that it'll have no debt or very little debt. So the 60% debt to GDP is not a problem for Scotland. What is a problem is the 3% deficit to GDP. And what that means very simply is that if the Scottish Government spends £100 billion into the economy every year, it's got to tax back £97 billion. And that's how you get to the 3% deficit. So what you're doing is you're always taking less back, but you can only take, you can't take any more than 97% back, or any less than 97% back. So this is what the 3% deficit means. So it's 3% of GDP every year. And this is a problem for a new Scottish economy. Now, I'm going to start here, and this is Scotland's historic public deficit. Now, this is different from the figures that you'll see in GERS, because this also includes income flows, net income outflows. So you'll see that the historic public deficit is always a deficit. It's always negative. And if you look closely, in these 25 years, there's only 3 years where Scotland's public deficit would have met the Stability and Growth Pact. 3 years out of 25. So this is the starting position. And very simply, we've got to go from where we are now to 3%. And this is what we looked at in details if the Scottish Government was to match the Stability and Growth Pact. So what we did is we projected forward, and we based the projections on the average economic growth rate of Scotland's economy from 2000 to 2019, which is 1.4%. Now, this is by far the best case scenario. It's likely that the Scottish economy this year will be stagnant or maybe grow by 0.25%. But we've projected forward at 1.4% growth. And when we do that, we find that budget deficit is expected to stabilise at around 12%. The private sector net financial savings is projected to be around 5%. Now, it's really important in any economy that the private sector, that's basically everyone apart from the foreign sector and the government, is able to save. And this is just saying that it's likely, if we have deficit at 12%, that the private sector will be able to save about 5% of GDP. And almost every economist would say it's a good idea in general for your private sector to be able to save. And then the foreign sector has a surplus of round about 7%. So we're projecting that to about 2040 forward, and saying if we take where we are now and we move forward, but we base it on a bigger growth rate, these are the figures that we've got. Now, this allowed us to say, if an independent Scotland complies with the Stability and Growth Pact, it would collapse economic growth, raise unemployment, and reduce public goods and services. It would also likely increase household debt stress, disproportionately affecting the lowest earners, women, children, and minority groups. Now, you might see that as being a very big jump from what I've shown you before, and we go into a lot of detail in our report to explain how we get to that. But very simply, it is looking at the impact of a government who's spending 12% of GDP suddenly, or over a period of time, spending 3% of GDP while the economy grows, not while the economy shrinks. So this is the impact that we're suggesting will happen if the Scottish Government does go ahead and follow the Stability and Growth Pact. But I want to take it back to that really first important point that I mentioned on the slide. We've tried to use this as an example to say to the Scottish Government, it's clear that you haven't thought about this economic plan for Scotland. And here's a clear example. Here's all the evidence. How do we move from 12% to 3% without austerity? It's a fairly simple question, and we're going to be asking the Scottish Government for an answer. So we looked at in a bit more detail in the paper, and again, we thought, right, let's start with the best case scenario. Scotland's economy grows for the next 15 years at 1.4%. How do we get to this 3% from the 12% that we are now? And we decided to come up with 4 pathways. So you'll see them there. Pathway one is that it takes us 3 years and we get to that 3%. Now that would mean a 12.5% reduction in government spending every year for 3 years to get to that level. Pathway 2, 5 years, 7.5%, and then 3 and 4. I think it's important that you just look at that, and in every one of those pathways, you'll see that the only way we get to a 3% deficit limit is successive years of large cuts in government spending. It's the only way that you can do it to get to the 3% deficit limit. When it's at 12, and it's got to go to 3, the only way to do that, if you can't grow the economy, is by cutting government spending. Now, here's a couple of things that might shock you. Pathway 2, the 5 years path, is pretty much the route that was forced on Greece in 2010. Now, we all know the problems that the Greek economy went through, but even now, the World Bank said that the economy in 2024 in Greece was 77% of the size that it is now. So 25 years later, it's still 25% smaller than it was, a huge reduction in GDP because of austerity. Now, the best pathway, and this is probably a more important point, the best pathway that takes us 15 years, and that's a very long time if we're thinking about converging with the UK economy and having the euro. The best pathway is pretty much what happened to the UK during the 2010 to 2015 austerity years. And as you may remember, we've had people on our show before who spoke about the 300,000 deaths caused by austerity in the UK over that period. So even the best, slowest pathway is still a huge and potentially devastating amount of austerity for Scotland. So our best case scenario, summing up here, the non-government sector, that's me and you and everyone that you know, must shrink by approximately 2% GDP every year for 15 years to meet those rules. This is severe austerity. Converging with the EU would kill Scotland's wellbeing economy before it can even get going. So I'm expecting some of you might be watching this thinking, how can this be the case? Surely you've got everything wrong. And I want to have the opportunity to answer some of your questions. And here's 3 things that I'm sure will come up. And these are from the comments we've had. But Scotland doesn't have a deficit, William. What are you talking about? But GERS, if you've used that, is useless. It's just a terrible place to start. But surely if the economy grows, we just solve all of this. So those are 3 things that I'm going to cover if you don't. But we've got answers for all of that. And actually, if you look at the paper, there's another one that says, well, if we just attract loads of foreign direct investment, which is a plan, maybe that'll work. Okay, so we'll come back to that in the questions. So finishing up, our main conclusion that we drew from this 18 months of work and this 23-page, but going to 29, including the macroeconomic model that we've designed, was that the Scottish Government must focus on economic resilience. This means starting with a clean slate and tailoring our economic institutions. This idea that we have to converge really has to be challenged. And certainly the idea that we have to adopt the Stability and Growth Pact before we're even a member has got to be challenged directly this year. So we have said in our report that the Scottish economy needs economic resilient guide rails that concentrate on 4 things: full employment, sustainable resource use, price stability, and economic stability. And what you'll see there is there's no rule, or so there's no fiscal rules and there's no role for fiscal rules. And this is a question that I want everyone to ask. And this is what we've started, hopefully, this big conversation with the Scottish Government and with the Scottish public. What happens in the period after winning independence and before we become a member of the EU? What impact does convergence have on Scotland's economy? Please do read this paper, digest it and share it, because we're starting to challenge these assumptions that just simply joining the EU will make everything fantastic. And the main thing we've challenged is this idea of aligning to the Stability and Growth Pact before we're independent. Now, this is a really big report. It's got 2 main sections. Next week, we're going to come back and I'm going to talk to you about the economic framework that we've used, which is called sectorial balances. Now, this is the first time that anyone has ever created Scotland's sectorial balances. I've got them up on screen now and they're in our report, but I'm going to go into detail about what they are, what they tell us about the economy, and why I think they've got to be published next year alongside GERS. Okay, well, I know that was a lot of information to throw at you all, so I'll give you a little bit of time to digest this, and I'm going to remove that, and I can bring any of these slides back on if you want me to. But Karen, if you're ready, I'll bring you on screen. Hello, how are you doing?
I'm good, yes, yeah. I note today that we're still seeing inflation despite the monetary policy of the Bank of England. That monetary policy still doesn't appear to be working. Yeah. But we're not surprised about that.
Why are we not surprised by that, eh?
I have lots of questions, despite the fact that I've really just read the executive summary and a little bit more than that as well. So, and I want to say to our listeners, I want to be very clear about this before we start. Both you and I are not anti-EU. I would love to have my EU passport again and be able to go and live in the Netherlands for a couple of years, live in Germany for a couple of years. You know, I'd like to be able to do those things, but we're not a fan of the rules over deficits from the EU, and we think that they should change them. And I'm sure that Dirk Ehnts is probably busy trying to convince people that they need to think about that as well, now that he's working within the EU Parliament. So my first question is at the start of the executive summary. So it says here on the 4th bullet point, Scotland has experienced relatively low levels of public spending and investment over several decades compared to similar European countries. I mean, I would say that's probably been going on more than several decades, judging by having lived in another European country. And obviously you did as well. You lived in Spain, I lived in the Netherlands. And, you know, really that was a big moment where you go, oh yeah, this is how it should be. So what's your feeling about that? Do you think it's been more than a couple of decades? Do you think it's been longer than a couple of decades?
Well, I mean, and because it's a report that will hopefully be in an academic journal, it's evidence-based. So that was a direct quote from work that was done by Mariana Mazzucato and Laurie McFarlane. So that was a direct quote. But yeah, there's a wonderful quote from Danny Dorling, who says that, you know, in the 1970s, our investment was lower than Spain, you know, who'd just come out of being in a dictatorship. And in the 1990s, our infrastructure investment was lower than Greece. So this has been happening for a long time, and we can see it. And I think the more that people travel in Europe, they see it. You know, I watched the Tour de France and the Vuelta in Spain and the Giro, and it just goes through these beautiful towns, and you can see all the wonderful architecture and all the new buildings on these great roads. And you think, watch the Tour of Britain, and you'll see how completely different that is. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but feel that the establishment who were pro-Brexit didn't probably like people like you and I seeing how well functioning these other countries were, and possibly the country that we're from is maybe not functioning in the way it should be. I wanted to ask you about what are sectoral balances. So can you explain that?
Yeah, well, we've got a full show on that next week, but very, very simply, as simply as I can. And what I'll do, I'll bring up the slides again so you can see Scotland's sectorial balances. I don't want to go into this in too much detail, but this is a macroeconomic view of our economy, and it's an accounting identity, which means that the economist is not making anything up. It's not about ideology, or it's not about economic opinion. Basically, what this says is, if you look at an economy, every financial transaction has to balance. And when you take a step back, there's only three sectors of your economy. There's the foreign sector, there's the private domestic sector, and then there's the government sector. And all the financial transactions which happen inside that economy have got to balance. So someone's credit has to be someone else's deficit. And the sectorial balances are a wonderful tool for showing us that. And, I was able to show people what the public sector deficit was. So there's a flip side to that. And you can see it here in this picture. So the red is the government deficit. Now, that has to be balanced on the flip side by, if you look at the last 4 years, by a private sector surplus and a foreign sector surplus. It always has to balance at zero. So this framework really allows you to look at effectively where the money is going in the economy. So it's really, really useful. It's been used, I think in the report, we talk about it being used by the Reserve Bank, the Federal Reserve Bank in the US. JP Morgan, I think, used it recently. The European Central Bank have used it. We would like to see the Scottish Government using this and sitting alongside as part of GERS or separate from GERS, because you get hugely useful general ideas from this. And we cover that in report, and we'll cover that in detail next week.
Yeah, and you can see quite clearly in 2020, COVID, you can see that in the sectorial balance quite clearly. The next question I had for you is reducing the deficit after independence. So you did bring this up as one of the questions. So again, we're not a currency issuer just now. We don't essentially have a deficit. But do we want to reduce the deficit too much? This is what you're saying in this report is really, we need to be running a deficit around about 10 or 12% to be, running the country in the way that it should be as a modern economy.
Yeah. You look at the historic level, and and projecting forward with that growth rate, it's about 12%. And that was just basically saying 12% would keep us kind of where we are in terms of the sectorial balances. But man, could we spend that amount of deficit better? Right, giving perhaps 2% of that to people who are earning interest on bonds, spending 1% of that on defence. Absolutely. But what's really important to say is that we're not suggesting in any way that you look at that deficit and you think, well, brilliant. As soon as Scotland's independent, we can cut government spending by 20 billion. That doesn't work. And we can use the framework of sectorial balances to show people exactly why. But what we're seeing is Scottish government will probably have to spend about 90 billion every year. And we probably only want to pay back about 75 billion in taxes, because we all want to save, we all want to spend stuff with our new money. So the deficit is there. It just allows the other two sectors to effectively save or use currency the way that they want. And a really important point, and we mention it in a whole section in the paper, is that the fiscal balance, the fiscal deficit, is effectively what's left over. So it's something that's exogenous to the government. It can't control it. If the foreign sector is pulling 7% out of the economy and we want people to save, or people save 5% of GDP, then that deficit of 12% has to be met by the government. The government's balance is just basically what is used to level up the other two sectors in the economy. So it's completely the wrong thing for a government to target, because it's not in control of the deficit. It's ex ante. The deficit's always there, whatever it is at the end of the year.
Yeah, I mean, I should also clarify as well that for people like me, who I've recently had savings, actually, since COVID. It's when I've recently actually had a little bit more savings, because I am a very much a paid up member of the precariat, and for a long time, I didn't have any savings. But your deficit is also the money that's sitting in people's bank accounts that they're using month to month as well. So that's also part of the deficit. So just to make clear to people who are in that position, that, if you don't have savings, still the money that you're using is the deficit as well.
Yeah, so it's all the money that's in the economy that the government spent, that hasn't been taxed back yet. So that's what the deficit is, and that's why it's so important that we realise that, of course, we need a deficit. The natural position for a government is to be into deficit. If the government spends 100 billion and then taxes 100 billion back, no one's got any money. That's not how economies work. That's what the deficit is. The deficit is just simply the difference between what it's spent and what it's taxed back. And that's really important, because people are already looking at this and saying Scotland will be skin and it'll need a huge public. And we're saying, well, that absolutely will, but that's not a problem. And this is where the big educational piece around modern monetary theory and explaining to people what a deficit is and where it comes from is really important. And although that's not a big part of this report, I don't even think we mention modern monetary theory in the report. I have to double check it, but if we do, it's maybe once. But I don't think we mention it at all, because this isn't really about MMT. It's just showing what would the impact be of a government moving from 3% fiscal deficit to 12%. And I think that's really important for people who might be like, well, this is an MMT thing. It's completely not. It's a macroeconomic analysis of the economy that shows the impact of austerity and moving from a 12% GDP government expenditure to 3%.
Now, the other question I've got for you, I've got quite a few. Foreign direct investment, did you look at the outflows? Did you have more information on this at the end of the report?
Yeah, there's a wonderful bit of work that was done. I think it was last done in 2021 by the Scottish government, and they collected the figures, and we've got that chart in the report. And that 11.5 billion every year is an average amount, and you can actually see where that goes. And you can see, and this is a bit of work that I'm really going to try and do before Christmas, but this is fascinating, Kieran. You can see how much money effectively comes from Westminster into Scotland and then immediately leaves back to our UK. So when we're looking at this deficit that we've got, it might be that some of that actually goes back to whence it came. If you look at the deficit, so it might actually only be a nominal deficit that we've got at the moment as part of the UK that's a little bit smaller than that, but that doesn't impact, again, the difference between the sectorial balances. But that's in there, and it's one of the areas we looked at, because we said in the paper, well, what happens if we increase loads more foreign direct investment? Is this the way that we solve our problem? And when you take the sectorial balances approach, all that does mean is that you're paying more. The foreign sector surplus is higher, which means the government deficit has to be higher, assuming the private sector stays the same. So it's definitely not a way of making the balances better, although GDP might rise slightly because of what's done with that investment, but not enough to make any significant difference. So we do mention that. I'm actually going to bring in a question from Hashbury. Actually, there's a few questions I'm going to bring in, and I'm going to cover these very briefly. A lot of people have mentioned EFTA, and I think it's really important. We've got nothing about joining the EU or nothing about EFTA in this paper. This is simply about the decision for Scotland to align with the Stability and Growth Pact before we join. Now, at some point, if we were members of the EU, we would have to do this, and you can take that forward. But this isn't a comment on the EU and EFTA. I think this is a very different, it's a good question, but a very different topic for us to be covering. And it's the same question about if there's any different from if we have free ports or not. These things are just so minimal in terms of the difference that they make to the fiscal balance. The issues with free ports are much more around the makeup of that private sector surplus. Nothing really much to do with the government surplus. So if we chuck them out, that might make a little bit of a difference to the deficit, but not much at all. And then the final question is about would foreign countries not have to hold the new Scottish currency? I think this was maybe when I'd said that if we move towards Europe, then the net outflows would likely to increase. And what we're trying to say is, yeah, of course, you would need to hold Scottish currency to buy things, but we need to buy euros to buy their things. And if you're a small nation in Europe, you have a bigger trade deficit when you're in Europe than when before you arrived. So that outflow is without a shadow of a doubt going to increase. So the private sector surplus at 7%, if we were to join Europe, might go up to 8, 9, 10%. And again, if we want the public to save, then the government or the public deficit has to increase to match that out. So these are not any ways of us solving the key issue that we've got. But thanks for the questions. Any more, please do drop them in.
So my next question is expert-led growth. Why not? I get the impression from the paper that you and Dirk are not a fan of this. So explain your thinking on this.
Again, not taking a MMT lens to this, which could say actually exports are bad and imports are good. This is not an argument that we've made at all in the paper. What we just basically said, hey, if you produce more and you turn your foreign sector deficit into a surplus, that allows a government surplus to reduce. Because again, if you look at the sectorial balances, so at the moment, 7% goes abroad. If we drop that down to 2%, then the government deficit could fall by 5%, right? So the best case scenario, because it's a 7% now, would be the government's deficit dropping from 12% to 5%. And that's if we somehow managed, and no real modern country certainly not in terms of trade, maybe Ireland in terms of financial services and net flows, no country has gone from the position we're in of having deficit to substantial surplus in a matter of years. So we think it's highly unlikely, and put that on top of the terrible trading conditions that we have right now, the impact of the ecological crisis, the fact that Scotland doesn't have access to Europe from any of its ports. It doesn't have direct road links to Europe. These are all significant issues that we would say, hey, maybe we could increase exports at some point, but not for the foreseeable future to any extent where it would make a difference.
So the next question I have had is on supply side policies. Supply side policies, no. Supply side policies, yes. What do you think?
Yeah. So we tried to kind of, when we put the paper together, Dirk kind of said, I think you need to explain what this is. And it's actually his couple of paragraphs in the paper. But he just basically said, this is just the idea that there's things that you can do in the private economy that will make all the difference. And we're hearing it now from AI companies, and they're saying, build these £70 billion data centers and everyone will be able to do all the things so much quicker, and it'll be the best thing that's ever happened to the UK in terms of productivity. And in the paper, Dirk says, yeah, we kind of heard this in the 1990s with like personal computers. And then we heard this in the early 2000s with like the internet. But basically, productivity has stagnated right across the global north over that period of time. And maybe you could say that AI is this one thing that fundamentally changes the productivity, but we're not buying it. We think that what it will do, AI will allow the wealthy to earn more money. The idea that this is a technology that's going to allow all people like us to work less, to be able to do things much more efficiently and take the day off, there's just absolutely no evidence for that. And then this also leads on to these ideas that are fairly kind of conservative or neoclassical, and the kind of Kate Forbes ideas that we just need to be more entrepreneurial and more innovative, and all these ways will improve everything. And we see in the report that probably if you bring these in, they're likely to redistribute the amount of income that the private sector has, but it's not going to expand your economy to any position where you can avoid the problem, which is this need for the government to reduce the government spending. So I'm afraid there's no great news in terms of supply side issues or policies as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would have thought that the obvious thing in the northern sector of the globe is that we have an aging population in most of the northern countries. So, of course, productivity is going to go down in those countries. Yeah. That's complete sense. So, you also mentioned rejecting arbitrary rules, and that sounds good to me. So, can you say some more about that?
Yeah, this is at the heart of the report, which is that almost every Western government has some form of fiscal rules. Now, some of them have fairly loose rules. And I think New Zealand says something like, we need a deficit at whatever the Crown decides is best, right? But they've got some kind of guardrails. But the fiscal rules in Europe are almost kind of being rode Russia over at the moment with what Germany's doing. And a lot of companies are able to extend these fiscal rules, but just for defense. You know, so we say in the report, is the era of fiscal rules over? And we suggest that. But at the core of the paper is analysing this idea of the Scottish Government to match EU's rules. And someone said, well, Scotland doesn't have to apply the Stability and Growth Pact. And we said, yeah, we know. That's not the point. The point is that the Scottish Government, as part of their economic plan, have said that's what they're going to do. And that's what they need to challenge. So when Scotland sets up its economy, and we've got a big, I think the final couple of pages, and I'm really proud of this, is saying, actually, when we become independent, these are what our economic guide rails are. And as I showed you, it's resilience, sustainable resource use, price stability, and full employment. That's what you focus on. And this is based on a concept called functional finance, which is kind of, you can trace back to Keynes, and then it was developed by Abba Lerner, and it frames part of underpins modern monetary theory in terms of its suggestions on how you run our economy, is to think about it in these things. The fiscal rule, the fiscal public balance, as we said, is ex ante. You can't really cover that, so don't try, but focus on the things that are really important in your economy, like having low levels of inflation or prices, have full employment, have sustainable resource use, and think about how you're making your country continually more resilient. Those are the things that are much more important than having this arbitrary made-up rule. And you might remember we asked Dirk how this rule came about, this 3% rule. It started in Europe, it went right across, and he basically said it was two guys in the back of a taxi. Well, one's too low, five's too high, three's what France normally is, so why don't we have it as 3? And they went, yeah, that sounds great. But this is the rule that we've adopted right across the global north, and it's significantly impacting the poorest people in society. And it was literally done like that. 3% sounds good. So we need to get rid of those rules in an independent Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, Bill Mitchell said in one of the podcasts I listened to that he'd researched this, and it was literally a Mandarin, a civil servant in the Mitterrand government that just said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. and lots of people have suffered because of that very influential person. I mean, the other example, of course, is the escape clause, you know, that the EU adopted also during COVID. You know, and I think you make a really good point that I think also the problem is that there are too many people go into politics that just don't have this basic understanding of a fiat currency, what you can do with it, what you can't do with it. And so they go into government and they just sort of bow down to what the Treasury in whatever country that they are is saying. And of course, we know that a lot of the economists that are working in government and in treasuries, you know, in lots of different countries have some very orthodox ideas. But I think that's starting to change.
Kieran, I'm just going to bring, there's a really good point here from the audience, which builds on that. It says, how do we best educate the public on what will be very complicated subject for a very large number of people? And as you said, Kieran, including policymakers. But this is what we've got to do. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, it's going to be a while before Scotland's independent. So we've got a runway to be able to educate both policymakers and the government. And if we can get policymakers first, then it's much easier to start to educate and inform the public when they understand what these decisions mean. But absolutely, Alex, if you've got any suggestions or any ideas, then go for it. And then the final question, Kieran, before we come back to you, we've got a point from Hashbury about what does full employment actually mean. And Kenny says, full employment, would this only be possible if Scotland abandons its current socialist economy? I think that's a joke, Kenny, and moves to a more Singaporean model. So Scotland in no way has a socialist economy now. It would be certainly my idea that we move much towards that. But full employment means anyone who wants a job has a job. So most people are employed by the government sector in proper full-time jobs, or they're employed in the private sector. But there's a whole hunk of cheap people who can't get a decent job who are unemployed. And full employment means making sure that all of those people have a dignified, well-paid job. And that's the role of government, the fundamental role of government. And it was through the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and the 70s, and we've completely forgot that. And we can see the huge issues in our economy and our society because the government doesn't think it's its job to make sure that everyone has a job. And I do, Kieran does, and most MMT people agree with that. So full employment means a job for everyone because labour's not working. And, you know, we really need to change that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just common sense that, you know, your human resource, if you view your country and your people as a human resource, then you want the human resource to be as productive as possible. And that's either paid employment or in education. And both of these things are, you know, going to enhance your country if you're running the country to enhance it. And I would say that some governments are not really doing that.
It's a really important point before we move on, but it's not the private sector's job to give everyone a job. Mm-hmm. It's their job to make money, to make a profit, make a sustainable profit for them. They see jobs as a cost. If they can do some work without giving someone a job or having the cost, they will do it. Mm-hmm. So if you want people to have a job, you've got to offer them the job. And that's the final point I want to say about full employment, is that there will be people who are unable or unwilling to work, but a job guarantee says there is a job here for you if you want it. That's how we move towards to full employment.
Yeah, and I think also as well, I mean, I feel that the unions are not everywhere that they need to be. You know, certainly I noticed the difference when I came back to Scotland as well. And I think a job guarantee really gives the kick up the backside to the private sector to say, if you're not employing people at a rate where they're going to have a decent lifestyle, they're going to join in the economy in other places, like going out to restaurants and doing things in the economy, then if you're keeping people in a situation where they're literally just surviving, that's not good enough. We need our citizens to have more than that. And we believe that's the case, because otherwise other parts of our economy are not going to work, and our economy is going to be threadbare in lots of sectors. So I think a job guarantee also is going to enhance lots of different sectors and make it work. But the next thing I wanted to actually ask you about was, you also say at the bottom, the Scottish Government need to maintain sectorial balance statistics. So they're not doing this right now.
No. There's the US maintains balances, and I think you can go onto the St. Louis Fed, and I think you can look for sectorial balances for other countries. And Modern Money Lab in Australia collects sectorial balances, and there may be some countries that do it, but we are pushing and advocating that Scotland releases its sectorial balances, and I think there's a good chance that might happen.
Okay, that sounds promising. So historic deficit, you mentioned historic deficit, but again, you know, I'm reluctant to own up to that when I feel that actually we haven't had enough currency spent in Scotland. So what do you mean by historic deficit?
Yeah, so, you know, it's a very technical term. A public sector deficit is the amount of money that's spent in or on Scotland's behalf, which is an important point, and how much is paid back in tax. And when you look at the figures in GERS, that shows that much more is spent. The government spends more than it collects. And that's the Scottish deficit. That's the Scottish public deficit. Now, that Scottish public deficit comes from three different types of spending. It comes from your local authority spending. It comes from your subnational government, which is Holyrood, and it comes from Westminster. And those three levels, they all spend, they all contribute to the public deficit, and then we pay taxes to local council, Scotland, and Westminster. And there's always a different, or there has been in that historical sectorial balances of round about 12%. And that's the difference. So it's a very technical term. And yet I would agree completely, it's not enough. We're not spending enough money into our economy. However, if we're spending a lot of that money and it's disappearing abroad, then maybe we are spending enough money. But the problem is that the money is leaving the Scottish private sector and showing up as a surplus in the foreign sector. And for me, that's one of the big insights that's come out of this analysis of sectorial balances, that the problem is that the Scottish government are too good at encouraging foreign direct investment, and there's too many countries in Scotland that are headquartered and sending profits to other places, including England. And this is what the government needs to address if it wants to be much more resilient and preparing us for a better economy once we're independent, but crucially, a better economy, much more focused on community wealth building now.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Those are really my questions on this paper, and I look forward to reading all of it.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thanks very much for that. Kenny, you've got another question here about a socialist economy and huge inflation and stuff like that. I don't see in any way how that's related to the topic that we're discussing tonight, which is the difficulty of moving from a 12% deficit to 3%. And in your terms, that would be less inflation and less of a problem. So I'm not going to directly comment on that because I don't think it's relevant. But any other questions, do just quickly drop them in before we head off. But yes, certainly I'm going to do a few videos on this that you can watch at your leisure, because I do understand that this is really detailed. And as I think, was it Alex that said earlier? Alex Thomson, yeah, it's really important that we do get people to understand this. And in a sense, we wanted this to be a little bit of a shock paper. We want people, even if they're supportive, especially if they're supportive of Scottish independence, to realise that the plan that we've got will not lead to the type of society they want. So that was the first thing. I think we're already addressing that. And the second thing we want to say to people, a public deficit is nothing to be scared of. We need to be able to say to people when they say to us, well, an independent Scotland will have 12% public deficit. We need to be able to say, well, yeah, that's because it's structured that way and it's likely we probably need it to go up. We need to be much more confident, because if we don't, we end up adopting these things like fiscal rules, which cause austerity and will absolutely, without a doubt, have the potential to completely undermine the whole independence project. But as I said at the start, this is just one area. And for me, it's a bit like a house of cards, Kieran. If you start looking at, well, we'll use sterling for 2 years, the same problems. If we just have a central bank that just looks like the Bank of England, the same problems. If we take these fiscal rules, same problems. If we encourage FDI, same problems. We really need an alternative approach to be able to put it in front of the Scottish government so they can avoid all of these huge mistakes that are in the current plan for independence.
Yeah, absolutely. That all sounds very sensible to me.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Please do like and share this episode and, of course, the paper. And if you found that stimulating, join us next week when we're going to go into a little bit more detail about sectorial balances. You'll better understand this whole kind of like flow and the stocks and the differences after the episode next week. Thanks everyone for joining us. If you're enjoying this episode of the Scotonomics podcast, please consider joining us on Patreon with a paid subscription for as little as £3 per month. Your support will ensure we can continue to create this podcast. Find the link in the show notes or head over to patreon.com/Scotonomics. Also, please do like, share, and comment on this podcast.